Microphone check, 1, 2, what is this? It's the 5'7" assassin in the podcast business. I am your host, Rohan Patra, the rap music plug at your service.
Here we are again at the end of a rainbow.
The Rap Music Plug podcast presented by QLC TV is the remedy to the I don't have anything good to listen to problem. Through in-depth album and song reviews, as well as artist interviews and general rap commentary sprinkled in between on all of what the mainstream and underground rap scenes have to offer, this is your one-stop shop to knowing what to add to your queue, play next, or pop into your record player. Welcome to the show. Detroit's Quelle Chris is currently on a run that has already cemented himself as one of the most important hip-hop artists of the past decade. His oddball eccentricity, insightful perspectives, lyrically and musical mastery has powered his music to amazing heights that produced some of my favorite records in recent memory, particularly 2016's Being You Is Great, 2018's Everything's Fine with his wife and exceptional rapper Jean Grey, and 2019's Guns that all blew me away. Chris has been at the forefront of hip-hop's creative renaissance for the better part of the last decade, and at this point in his career, Quelle not only is aware of that, but is trying to come to terms with what that means to him and what he has learnt along the way on his long journey to what many would call success. Yet, as is made abundantly clear on DEATHFAME, the latest album from Quelle Chris, this is a loaded word that has a lot of implications for Quelle that doesn't always paint a clean, rosy picture. After the expansive, grand, and longer Innocent Country 2 that dropped on the heels of the beginning of the pandemic in 2020, Quelle made an album that is closer to the tightly knit and ultra-focused Guns, where the album is intent on driving home a particular feeling and message. The beauty of DEATHFAME is in the details and in its sincerity. This is not an album that was an immediate stunner for me. I'd say even more than the standard Quelle Chris album. DEATHFAME really keeps to itself and takes some time to really reveal itself to the listener. But what makes DEATHFAME feel especially different than past Quelle records is that he's never really leaned into this dark and melancholy vibe quite like he does so consistently on this album. The usual comedic detours or dry humor are much less common. Instead, Quelle brings us onto a journey into his psyche, sounding like a man that is painfully aware of his mortality and his place as a hip-hop vanguard. Quelle feels equally at peace with the good that comes with his success and accepting, or at least making an effort to really grapple with the bad that comes with it too, and the negative implications that do come with succeeding in such a corrosive and sometimes toxic industry. It's a very measured perspective that I find to be quite inspiring, because DEATHFAME really makes itself to be an album that is the antidote to feeling too high or too low, where putting this album on is remarkably sobering, yet gives you just enough gratitude and just enough of a positive outlook to feel like, hey, there may be a lot of bad that's going on in the world and in my life, but I still have the opportunity every single day to be intentional with the love I spread to those that I admire and cherish, and stay focused on what truly matters in life, without getting too wrapped up in the never-ending pursuit for status that plagues the modern man today. It promotes a good mindset that doesn't simply indulge in the existential dread, and instead informs a positive next step versus getting caught up in this defeatist mindset. Over the years, really ever since Being You Is Great, my still favorite Quelle Chris album, Chris has just become a powerhouse at creating albums that focus on a consistent theme while still bringing enough musical variety to make the record feel well-rounded. DEATHFAME is another example of his greatness as an album maker, since this latest album from Quelle once again has a distinct identity, focusing on the theme surrounding this concept of death fame, which, as he put in a recent interview with Dadbod Rap Pod, it's inspired by the idea of the unfortunate increased amount of fame and acclaim that the general public tends to give artists only once they pass away. Where Quelle finds that obviously to be quite sad, and obviously as an artist himself would want that kind of respect and adoration from his supporters and from the music world at large while he's still alive. It's an interesting thought that allows for Quelle to grapple with ideas of success and the balance of good and bad that comes with it, and his mixed feelings around the palpable love he does receive from his supporters, alongside some of the less than ideal realities. At the end of the day, he still is an indie artist, and there is still a relative lack of notoriety, respect, and monetary support that he and the other heavyweights of this art form receive overall, because it's clearly inconsistent with how incredible his music has truly been. But as Quelle and many of us know, skill and output isn't a one-to-one linear relationship with success in the rap game or the entertainment industry at large. This theme also gives Quelle license to speak more generally about his contributions to not only hip-hop, but as a middle-aged man, observing all that he has and hasn't accomplished in his life so far, since his views on his career are directly related to how he perceives himself as a person too, discussing some of the things he's grateful to have in his life, while also acknowledging some of the mistakes he's made along the way. Throughout DEATHFAME, Quelle is extremely transparent in the exploration of these topics, and I think that honesty and that really clear sincerity is what defines DEATHFAME for me. On the delicate lullaby of a song, How Could They Love Someone Like Me?, Quelle acknowledges an insecurity of sorts as it relates to people truly appreciating what he's created, yet also sort of toes this line of being accepting and at peace with it at the same time and understanding it. It's a very distinct thing that Quelle does throughout this record, where he really tries to find a balance and communicate that to the listener. There's a very prevailing honesty on the title track that I really appreciated, where Quelle is clear that him making music isn't just for the love of the art, showing the reality and the unfair view and stupid view, honestly, many listeners have towards the artists that they, on one hand, love, and then on the other hand, act like don't have families to feed too, and aspirations that cost money too in their lives. This is illuminated through some of the press Quelle has done with the release of DEATHFAME too, as he explicitly states that one of the key reasons that pushed him to kickstart the recording for this album was COVID's effect on touring, which was one of his key revenue streams, as it is for many indie artists. And that really put like a jolt of urgency and concern into Quelle's life, because he was obviously kind of concerned that he wouldn't be able to make ends meet in the way that he initially thought he would prior to the pandemic, especially because he just, right around the time of the pandemic, released Innocent Country 2. And so to those listening to this album, I hope statements like this from an artist like Quelle, an artist who has achieved a noticeable and recognizable level of success, is still speaking on things like this, speaking on the idea that it's very hard for indie artists out there. I hope people really understand that giving your flowers can't just end with a couple tweets. It really has to end up being cold hard cash, because especially on the back end, hopefully at least, of a deadly pandemic, that amplified financial and mental strain on some of the most cherished voices in the art form. I hope we understand that and take heed to that and put our money where our mouth is and actually give them the recognition and the support while they are still alive. And so when we focus on the musicality of DEATHFAME, the sound of this record is nothing new for Quelle on the surface. You can largely characterize the sound of this album as a brand of dusty, dirty jazz infused beats that we've come to know and love from Quelle. There's some incredible grooves on this record that are thick and gutter, like King in Black, that is in line with some of the other standouts from Quelle's career that feature these heavy drums and a thick, dusty layer of noise. Like My Contribution to the Scam comes to mind. This is a sound that Quelle has perfected time and time again, and he exhibits that mastery many times on this album. All that being said, though, there is a spacey atmosphere that is very distinct in these beats on this album, where reverb and various vocal effects add a level of hypnotic surrealism to the lyricism and the instrumental feel. It adds up to making DEATHFAME feel very worn in and weary. From the lyrical content to the way these beats are constructed, DEATHFAME feels like hip-hop that has truly been aged for many, many years, like a good wine, sounding wise and distinct from the microwave style music that is otherwise being made by many in the industry nowadays. One of my favorite instrumental moments that demonstrate just how very unique this album is on Excuse My Back. That sounds like you're hearing a soundtrack from a dusty old VHS horror tape that includes this quirky, cute Excuse My Back vocal hit that just sounds really sick to me for some reason. The Agency of the Future is another dense, murky brick of gutter hip-hop with one of my favorite beats on the record, showing DEATHFAME's killer dusty edge off very nicely. But the other side to DEATHFAME's musical palette is the often piano-driven, soulful jazz supplied by Quelle and frequent collaborator Chris Keys, who he worked in particular on Innocent Country 1 and 2. The organ keys on their collaborative production of Alive Ain't Always Living on this album was beautiful, and another instance of Quelle making some brilliance with this sound that very much is reminiscent of Mirage from Innocent Country 2. And it matches the lyrical highlight that is Quelle's performance on DEATHFAME, where I feel he does the absolute best job that he does on the entire record, distilling some true words of wisdom that center around gratitude and having perspective on what truly matters in the world. A similarly beautiful musical moment is in the fantastic Sky is Blue Because the Sun is Red that works in that same vein as the previous track mentioned, produced by Knowledge and Chris Keys, that features this gorgeous vocal sample that is one of my favorite parts of this entire album. And don't let the layers of abstraction and the contemplative subject matter fool you. Quelle still is an elite lyricist and therefore has some nice quotables and poignant bars that make an impact from that pure bar standpoint. Particularly, there is a steady diet of pop culture references that never fail to impress me on this album, like the Euphoria bar on The Agency of the Future, where Quelle geniusly raps "Burn Heavy, keep an ashtray near me like Fez workin'," referencing two characters from the show. And Quelle is also joined by some fantastic guest features that I think were very well selected in Shine. Navy Blue and Quelle proved to be a match made in heaven on track 6 of this record. But the biggest standout for me was Denmark Vesey. He had a ferocious feature on CUI Podest. Wow, we need that Denmark Vesey album that is supposedly in the works with a heavy involvement from Quelle, because his intensity and delivery on this track stole the show and injected a much needed dose of high energy to this album. So far, I think I have established that I really do enjoy DEATHFAME, but it's not without its faults. And so if we look at the beats here, for as good as they are, the production isn't as magnificently challenging or deeply soulful as Quelle's music can be and has been in the past. And overall, although I don't really have any qualms with any particular beat, there's no slouch on the track list, I find I'm not necessarily blown away by a good amount of these beats though either. This album lacks a significant amount of standout moments from a musical perspective, Obviously, I think this album is very well produced. I really do enjoy the hell out of these beats, but I don't think they always are incredibly impactful, as some of these beats blend together in a way that makes it sometimes feel a bit more one note or a little too consistent. Also, as I mentioned before, this album is a noticeably more solemn affair. Even with a few quirky bits here and there, that classic Quelle dry yet insightful humor is a lot less prevalent on DEATHFAME, and I find myself missing that. I really always have loved that aspect of Quelle's music. And as a result of this shift, I also feel like Quelle's energy level is noticeably much lower and even keeled than I'm used to. Quelle's never been a guy to really be incredibly aggressive all that often, but you definitely get those songs on a Quelle Chris album that are a little more zany, a little more off the wall, and kind of like a chaotic energy. But we don't really get any of that on DEATHFAME. And it makes this album kind of feel a bit more sleepy than I'd like. He's almost too zen and measured, where some of the fire of guns could have stoked a stronger response out of me as he details some of the many pitfalls of the industry on this album. Or it could have used more of those off the deep end vibes of internal chaos and painful introspection from Being You Is Great that would have maybe made the more vulnerable moments on DEATHFAME feel a bit more emotionally evocative. I understand that would inevitably not actually jive with Quelle's mind state through this album, which, as I've remarked earlier, isn't overly high or low, but stylistically, these wrinkles would have been a welcome change of pace. This more morose and more consistently serious and measured approach could have completely worked, though, without any reservations, because this is Quelle Chris we're talking about. This is a skilled lyricist and a masterful musician. However, although I commend Quelle's efforts to make an album that has a consistent focus in feeling, I don't think this album lyrically is not necessarily not clear in its intent enough, but I think other than some isolated moments where Quelle is sharing some interesting existential thoughts, I don't feel they always add up to a cohesive and strong thematic takeaway that consistently connects with me. Instead, I feel DEATHFAME more succeeds as a mood album, something I can put on when I need to even myself out and settle down after being on too much of an emotional high or too much of an emotional low. Something to really recenter myself. And that's obviously something I find valuable, but I have to say it doesn't feel intellectually stimulating as I would have liked and as Quelle has delivered in the past, since I find the layers of abstraction and the general reclusive nature of the album makes it hard for the prevailing messaging from Quelle to consistently register and resonate with me as the listener. There's a gray area inherent with the kind of tone Quelle is trying to strike, but I don't think he all the way pulls it off and communicates his vision to the absolute fullest. But all in all, DEATHFAME is a very wholesome listen with very consistent rapping that is quality and clever and generally great production. Even if this isn't the magnum opus, in my opinion, from a Quelle Chris that I love so dearly, it's still Quelle Chris we're talking about here. So this is still a great album and a continuation of a phenomenal creative streak that Quelle refuses to end. So there we have it, another episode of the Rap Music Plug podcast presented by QLC TV. I hope this episode gave you some new perspectives and insights into what the greatest art form known to man in hip-hop music has to offer. If you want to support the show in the most meaningful way possible, it would be my absolute honor to have you as a patron in the new Rap Music Plug podcast Patreon. Through this Patreon, you will be getting exclusive content such as bonus episodes, exclusive album recommendations, exclusive playlists, early access to episodes, and more. And above all, though, you will be able to support the show directly in a way that will not only justify the crazy amount of time I spend on this show already, but allow me to cover some of the expenses related to supporting all of these great artists that we cover on the show through the website, and will allow us to sustain and build on this amazing growth that the RMPP has experienced recently. Big shout out to Dano of Free Music Empire, Levi, Mahima, Jeff, Mitch, Dash Lewis, Pancake Cleaner, Trey, Noah, Justin, Brandon, Joe, Gavin, Matt, Teddy Faley, Jackson, Kian, Slumber Logic, Fatman Tomb, and Khalid for your generous support through the Patreon. I really appreciate it. So if you have any questions about any of the Patreon stuff, or just want to keep tabs on the show, interact with me on rap music and all the great stuff that we can talk about, follow me on Twitter and Instagram at rapmusicplugpod, or shoot me an email at qlctv.podcast@gmail.com. You can also rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts and subscribe on YouTube and Spotify as well. But that's enough self-promotion for this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Peace.